Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have a complete treat this evening to discuss the Embodied Steward, a theory of nested emergence and the technologies of self-maintenance by the one and only Clayton. I am joined also by Michael, who I love. Both of these gentlemen are incredible. I always enjoy immensely the opportunity to speak with them, everything they contribute, how their minds work, their thoughts, their persons, their hearts. The aura and the atmosphere that they bring into any space they enter is invaluable. And Clayton has shared this paper with both me and Michael. We both read it and enjoyed it immensely. So I just thought we would start by me saying, hey, Clayton, this paper, what's it about, man? What's it about? What's going on here? Clayton, good to have you, sir.
Oh, thank you, Daniel. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad the weather is holding, and yeah, that you know the internet is holding as well, and we're able to actually make this happen. It's been a few weeks in the making, but yes, thank God we're here. So yeah, this paper, it's sort of like a synthesis of, like, as Michelle would say, philosophize your life. I think I have been doing that in an unintentional way. And this one morning, I don't remember which day of the week it was, but uh, I had to go outside in the rain to pick up an umbrella from another car. And in the moment it rained on me, I fell into some weird differentiation moment. It's kind of like, okay, so why didn't someone come do this? It's because they were afraid of getting wet, like, to be made wet by the rain. Yeah, which makes total sense. Uh, and to me, it occurred to me that, yeah, I had been rained on, but I wasn't wet, because, like, there's a part of me which was not wet. And this was such a weird concept. And I kept noodling on that. And as I noodled on that, the, you know, the all all the different pieces of philosophy and science and everything I've been reading and working on over the years sort of meshed together for me in that moment. And I was like, oh, okay, so it seems like there is like a caretaker built in for this body, right? And it's not just the body doing things. Yeah, the body does things, but the me who is in there, um, seems like I have a responsibility to it. So, like, the body can get wet, but I can't get wet. Uh, so I need to do something to maneuver it somewhere such that it won't, like, this won't happen to it, like protect it from the elements. Like, oh, that means I have to dress it up. I gotta feed it. Oh, this, like, all these hygiene things, and it just all sort of like just fell alive, like when that one piece falls in place, and then things make sense. And it was so fascinating. And yeah, like, the thoughts did not stop. Like, I went down this rabbit hole. It was so alive in so many ways. And the paper started to happen. So I started to write it down, because, like, it wouldn't stop. Like, it was a stream of all these thoughts and all these connections that I just had to capture somewhere. And that's how we ended up with that paper. So yeah, it all started with rain.
Well, I love that story. And as you were speaking, it's like, it kind of reminds me of, so there were, when I think back, there was like a few moments that I guess were the start of like big thoughts. First, I think I was 8. I was sitting upstairs eating a box on a green carpet of corn pops. And I had this moment where I said, oh my gosh, I will never see my face. I will never, all I'll ever see is an image of my face. I'll never be able to like turn around and look at my own face. And I started crying, man. I was like, oh my gosh, what is this life? And that has always stuck with me. Second, I had a moment where I was in a bathtub reading the Red Wall book series, I think Martin the Warrior, and I was reading it, and then I was really freaked out because I was like, I'm seeing a mouse in my head. There's a mouse in my head. Like, I can see something while looking on black marks on white paper. That freaked me out because, like, how is that possible? How is it possible to see something when looking at something else? And then the other one is I had a moment where I was sitting in Unor and I looked at my hand and I said, if I stop thinking, my hand doesn't disappear. Therefore, it must not be the case that reality is simply a product of thoughts, because you can like turn your brain off and and the world doesn't vanish. So I was like, oh, so there's a distinction between thinking and perceiving. And that for me was big because a lot of agency actually develops on when you choose to think about what you perceive or when you choose to turn off your thinking and just perceiving. But I just love that story where you're talking about there's a part of me where I'm not wet, and it seems like my responsibility to keep my body from getting wet. I will say I am a big fan of thinking in terms of stewardship. I think that logic of the steward brings together so beautifully this tension between the agent, like the individual agent, if you will, and the communal or relationship or the other. And, I grew up on a farm and we all the time kind of had that metaphor of stewardship. And I think stewardship is also just really interesting because it's not like an engine where I know what to do to fix it. A steward, you can take care of a garden, you can do everything you're supposed to do, and something unexpected can still occur. Like, the plants can nevertheless die, and you always have to have this posture of a plan, but also prepared at the same time. And I think we are absolutely shaped by our metaphors way more than we realize. And if you never have the metaphor of a steward, if, say, you're always surrounded, Michelle will talk about the sociology of space and the idea that if you're in a space where you're constantly experiencing buildings or machines or whatever, then that just comes to be the natural way by which you think of all of reality. But say if you grow up on a farm where you're surrounded by fields that have to be cultivated or stewards, that can actually impact the way that you naturally think of reality. So we kind of absorb our metaphoric constructs from our environments a lot more than we realize, is what Michelle will say. And I think the concept of stewardship is completely invaluable because I think that starts opening ways to think about the self and the body and how I relate to the body and how it's not like a cheap dualism, but you'll talk about the pet, you'll talk about the astronaut, like these different ways to think about it that are way more useful. I'll ask you one more question and then throw it to Michael here. So let me read this part. So here is something nobody tells you when you're young. You are not your body, but you're not separate from it either. You are something stranger. You are the body's steward. You are what emerges when the body becomes complex enough to require its own caretaker. What are you getting at there, Clayton? What are you pointing to?
Oh yeah, that is deeply inspired by Michael Levin's work, and so he talks about the bioelectric field, and in his work, his research. I'm probably oversimplifying here, but ideally, what I take out of it is that they've done this research where they've been trying to modify biological creatures. They'll do a lot of experimentation on tadpoles and the like, and they're trying to create new life forms, and they had to try. And so in the experimentation, they came to find that it was really difficult to take a part of a creature and put it in another part where it shouldn't be. That wouldn't work. Like, for example, they tried to take eyes and put them, I think, on the foot or something. And every time they did that, the cells of the eye would get converted into the cells of the foot, and it wouldn't grow an eye on the foot. And this frustrated them. They said, well, how is it possible? Because like we know these cells make an eye, and when we put them, in this foot section, we should, copy paste it and it should just grow. And as they kept researching, they found that it's not simple genetics and it's not simple DNA. Like the instructions of how biological creature is made are not encoded in the genetic information. It's like the genetic information is like the implementation, but it also gets its instruction from elsewhere. It's like there's what he calls a platonic space, and so it's sort of like a memory that has been baked into what needs to happen in that space. And I'm probably oversimplifying and misinterpreting at this point, but I'm going to describe it the way it made sense to me. Yeah. And so what I got from that was, so he talked about the bioelectric field, and he says there is this bioelectric field which already has the encoding and the information of how this creature should be and what needs to be in that space. right? So it's sort of like a little container for a community of cells. And so when you take an eye, which is coming from a different community of cells, to the food, you're taking it to a different community. It gets, let's say, what is the word? Like, it gets transformed to suit the behavior of the community there, because it's like these cells at the foot go like, oh, you're a strange one. What are you doing here? You shouldn't be behaving that way. You're trying to make an eye. We're foot cells, so we make feet here. So they'll, indoctrinate it and put it in shape, and it will behave as the rest of the feet cells, and it will get aligned. And so this is what happens. And so, but then they found that you could edit the bioelectric information in that space. And so when they edited the bioelectric information and told it build an eye on the foot, then the cells in that foot community built the eye on the foot. And then that was so strange, because they're like, oh, so we've been thinking like we have to micromanage the cells, we have to tell them what to do and how to behave through, the genetic engineering. But actually, we don't need to do that. We need to find a way to talk to them. That's how he actually describes it. It's like, we have to find a way to communicate to the cells through this information in the bioelectric field. And once we channel the information, like we ask them nicely, they will do everything else. They don't have to explain to us how they do it. They just need to know what to do. And so this has been so informative for them in their research that I think they've been doing some cancer research as well. And they're saying what they envision is that in the future, if they're successful, there will be like a remedy for, like our human bodies, where you sort of get a reset of your bioelectricity, and then that sort of like sorts out all the places in your body where the cells are misbehaving as opposed to how they intended to be behaving. And that should start solving a lot of disease and deformity and all sorts of ailments. And yeah, so it was so fascinating for me, because it seems as though like you need, like, the cells have a mind, like they're carrying a memory, and they're on a mission. Yeah. And after looking at, developmental, child developmental studies, you start to see things like when a child is developing, it's gradual, like their parts develop in a gradual way, right? And so, of course, they spend a lot of time in their mother's womb, kind of like getting to a place of coherence. And when they come out of that body, then they still have to develop further. But the strangest thing is that even for you guys, you find that your earliest memory of who you are doesn't really go beyond, 3 years or so. Like, you'll be amazing if you can remember beyond 2 years, like, to a point before you had speech, right? And so it's kind of like you're required to develop certain competences at a certain point, and then these competences will cohere. And once they cohere, then the thing you call myself sort of emerges. Like at that, there's a certain point where all the components that make you up will align in a way that you show up. But the thing that fascinated me was like, why? Like, why does all that need to happen? And it seems like the body has lots of automations, a lot of reflexes, at all the levels. Like it's built in all these ways, all these mechanisms to solve these problems. It's developed all these systems, all these organs. They're all doing their jobs. And so there's a lot that's going on within you that you're not aware of, and you're not in control of. The body does its thing. But why does it need you? Because if it could just do it, then it should just do it, right? Like you don't see trees doing a self thing, right? Like they're not going through a meaning crisis of sorts, right? Maybe they do. We don't know, right? It's a tree having a meaning crisis, and we don't know why it's having one. Uh, but jokes aside, uh, we humans like suffer from that more. I guess like rocks have a meaning crisis as well for not being able to move, uh, but I guess we suffer from it more. So the question is like, why do we suffer from it more? And it seems there's a there's a reason for this thing we call a self, and it has a commitment to the body, and it requires the body to continue existing. And I guess that's why we die, right? So, like if the body dies, then there's no need for a self anymore, right? And even before the body is coherent in a certain way, then it won't have that enacted self, that autonomous self. Yes, it's going to be there, and there's room for it. But before all of this happens, it's not required. And it seems to me like there's a certain age, there's a certain time in which it is required to be there, and it has a certain job, and it has a certain responsibility. If you look at it like in a phenomenological way, like in a way that we are interacting with the world around us, there is a specific responsibility in there on top of other things. I'm not saying it doesn't have other things, but there's a one key job which is responsible to this body where it has shown up, and I guess we get to do that job. But it's so easy to forget. Like we can get lost in that self and kind of go like, I think I'm here, all right, I'll do whatever I want. It's like, yeah, sure, do whatever you want, but you have a job as well. It's like you didn't put yourself there, right? Maybe you need to find out why you're there and what else you need to be taking care of, what else you need to be addressing, on top of trying to achieve all the other things you as a self want to achieve. You still have certain built-in responsibilities that you should always be on top of. And if you don't do that, there are like consequences, and they are gradual, and they compound, and there's lots of side effects that are going to impact you being able to achieve your self goals if you don't take care of all these physical constraining things that are waiting for you, or that you are expected to take care of when you are given that job as the self of this specific instance of the being. But anyway, I think I'm starting to ramble there. But ideally, that's sort of the synthesis. That's what brought it together, and I guess that opening part is coming from all of that.
Well, I think that's fantastic. I mean, there's a few things that come to mind, and I'll throw it to Michael for anything. I love how you're asking. So why isn't everything automatic, right? Like if so much of the body is automatic, why isn't everything automatic? Why the Chalmers zombie, right? And when you write, like, for example, consciousness is the body's solution to the problem of its own complexity. So there's a point where the body is too complex to automatically coordinate itself anymore, quote unquote, right? And so it would seem as if consciousness is needed, as I think, meta coordinator might be the term you like. There's a kind of meta coordination that is needed, right? Where, you also write, like, there comes a point, say evolutionarily, developmentally, however we want to put it, that the body needs something more. The body became too complex for autopilot alone. It needed something more: capacity to anticipate, to plan, to respond to a chaotic environment that changes faster than evolution can adapt to. It needed prediction. It needed foresight. It needed you. I love that. It needed you. That's nice. That's nice. Elegant. The reason this is very compelling, because indeed there does seem to come a point where the autopilot, which almost by definition could only respond to the immediate, will be inadequate when your threats or the environment actually goes beyond the immediate. Like evolutionarily, I think people forget that evolution is inseparable from environment. Like when you say the survival of the fittest, well, what defines what's fittest, right? The environment does, right? So, in one environment, one can imagine being like super strong would actually be bad because now you're heavy and you drown or something, right? But in another environment, being super big and super strong might be good because all of the surrounding predators will kill you, right? So actually, what constitutes fitting is almost already kind of Platonic in a certain way because it's like a form, like fitting, Aristotle, the mean, which is already kind of environmental. And so, like, what actually entails what is fitting is the environment. And it's almost as if there comes to be a certain point where the body's environment is no longer just its immediacy. It's its immediacy plus horizon, if you will. And like what's over and when I say horizon, I kind of mean over the horizon. Like it comes to kind of there's that your environment is no longer simply your immediate stimulus. It is possibility almost, right? It is scenario. And you thus need to develop consciousness to deal with the complexity of having to take care of consciousness. The other thing I heard you saying that is just very, very interesting is that, and I'm no expert on Levin's work, but if there's this kind of idea that the individual is always in a certain negotiation with the community or the cell with the group, right? So if you just take an individual cell and throw it in a random group, then it's going to almost be like it's not going to fit. It's just not going to develop, like because the community has almost a kind of field effect affecting how it can develop and what it can develop into, right? And so you have to negotiate with the community to say, okay, no, make an I. And if you can get the community to agree, then it will make an I, right? But an individual can't just show up, quote unquote, without communication, right? There's a problem of communication. If you just show up, the community is going to just keep doing what it always does, and it's never going to form the individual, right? And you're going to have like a mismatch, right? But if you can actually establish a kind of line of communication, then it actually becomes possible to change the formation, the form, the directionality, like how things form, right? This I think is just very interesting because also when you're talking about the idea, like I love the point that you're making, like if you say, what do I want to do? Well, there's one level of complexity here is you've already got the community of the body, right? Like I versus the body, right? So if you just say, what do I want to do? The body may have already be having shaping like influence on what can be done. And there's a mismatch there, right? So you need to ask what do I want to do that is taking seriously the responsibility of the role of the body that I'm stewarding, right? And so you've got to ask that. But what's also just very interesting is the body is always already environmented. It's already in an environment. So the consciousness also is asking, if it takes seriously the question of how do I steward the body, it has to also at the same time ask what is fitting for the environment and how do I negotiate what's good with the body with the environment, right? And maybe that's part of the complexity that requires the consciousness because it has to ask about both of those simultaneously, right? And if it was just asking about the body, well, then that could lead to a mismatch between the body and the environment. It actually has to do the meta move of saying body and environment and the relation between them as well, right? Like in how they actually are kind of forming together. So it's just very interesting to think of Levin in that context. Like to ask, how do I steward the body? The ego has to ask, I guess I'll say ego. The ego has to ask like, okay, I can't just assert myself against the body because the body is forming me. So I have to ask the question of what would actually be good to steward the body. But that question is inseparable from how do I negotiate with the environment that the body is in. And that kind of creates the complexity that almost in that tension requires consciousness to handle. Like, because it's stewarding both things at the same time as the same thing at the same time. I'm saying, a bunch of things. So it's interesting to think of Levin in that context. I have a lot more sticky notes, but I'm going to throw it to Michael on any thoughts on anything about anything whatsoever, including Duck Hunter on the NES, which also was a philosophical revelation when I realized that if you plug up the second controller, your brother could actually play as the duck. Did y'all know that? Like if you plug up, you can make it a two-player game where somebody controls the ducks. That also taught me the importance of mystery and surprise and investigation, which was a philosophical revelation. So Michael, good to see you on this fine day, sir.
Oh, it's great to be here. Just kind of a funny kind of point of convergence on like what are the main kind of beats of when we develop consciousness. I remember when I was like 2 years old, I don't even think I was walking yet. And I looked at myself I looked at my reflection in my sliding door mirror, and there's still a picture like my mom took of me, like with my hand against the mirror, and I genuinely thought my reflection was like a friend. Like I did not realize it was me. I thought it was someone else, so I was like, like so like affectionate with it, and I was like, oh my gosh, like look. And I would talk to this like imaginary voice in my head, like not as if, like usually when people talk to like voices in their head, like they're kind of talking to like themselves. Like I would like talk as if I was talking to someone else. I would like come home from school and I'd be like, oh hey, how was your day, like checking in with them, like as if they weren't me. But I first of all, just yeah, thank you for sharing the paper with me. It was an honor to read. I love this idea of um the body as a steward. I think it's really it's certainly an improvement upon the body as a computer or machine or automaton or anything like that. And I think because you touch on um, kind of this idea that there are these signals and messages that our body gives us around needs that it has that we need to learn to read and to respond to. Um, and I don't know if we were recording when we were initially checking in, but for people listening, I'm a master's student in counseling psychology, and so I was telling Daniel and Clayton before the call that I'm in this addictions class, and I'm also in a trauma class this quarter, so heavy stuff. But I was just thinking about how we had this reading last week where we were reading about the formation of the 12-step program and kind of the genesis of that whole program. And I didn't know this prior, but Jung actually had a very instrumental part in creating the 12 steps. After this work with this client, his name was Roland, this guy who had been a chronic alcoholic, I believe, and he had kind of tried everything that there was to try. And so this was in the 60s when Jung was really popular, and so he thought, okay, I'm gonna reach out to this guy. I'm going to fly to Vienna, and I'm going to start psychoanalysis work with him. And they worked for a year, and he comes out of it extremely confident in his ability to kick his addiction. And he goes home, and within a couple of months, he's using again. And he writes this letter to Jung, kind of just despair ridden, asking to come back to work with him. And he comes. Actually, my therapist's grandfather, his name's Sam Schumacher, he was a member of this group and was like a really big part of the formation of the AA. And this guy goes into church and he has this encounter with God and he stops using. And so the first step of AA is like we have to admit our powerlessness over alcohol. That directly comes from Jung's work with Roland. That was something that he said. It's like you are at the level of the ego, which is even great psychotherapeutic work. It's like it's often at the level of the ego, right? It's like at the level of like habits, behaviors, like even like thought patterns and things like that. And so I bring all of that in to say, like, one thing that Jung talks about is that the addict is actually, by reaching for substances, they are actually reaching for spiritual wholeness. He talks about this like spiritual instinct that everyone has. And so, for him, addiction is not this like moral failing. It's not this like lack of willpower or anything like that. It's like a misplaced and unintegrated like reach for spiritual wholeness. And so I guess kind of the question that I'm left with, with that reading and then in lieu of your paper is like, how do we make sure that we respond? Because it's one thing to notice, okay, I have a desire for, or I have a need to fulfill my hunger, my food hunger. I also have this like spiritual hunger, this like kind of desire for love and connection and community and all of that. Um, but then it's another thing to respond like well to that, right? And to also resist the all of the different kind of distorted forms of those, of fulfilling those needs that the world presents to us. So and for me personally, um, it seems like you have to go through some trial and error to get to that. Like there's the kind of, I think the talking with a friend recently, there's kind of like multiple meaning crises. Like the first meaning crisis is when you actually recognize that you have these like meta level desires that you've kind of been suppressing. And then the second meaning crisis is like when you actually try and fulfill those desires and you inevitably trip and fall and get taken down the wrong paths, and like you have to like realign yourself. You spend 15 years in one religion only to realize it was like the wrong worldview, or what, whatever. So it seems like there's a lot of like, there's like the recognition of signal, but then there's also the constant moment and I think you mentioned this in the paper, like the embodied steward is like a moment to moment conscious awareness. It's not a one-time decision, just like on a farm, you are constantly moment to moment having to pay attention to how your crops are doing and what they need. But yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed the paper. I think it's I before I pass it back, I think the other thing that this framing really highlights is that unlike a closed system like a computer or a machine, um, if you're stewarding something, it has a life beyond yourself. Like it require or yeah, it requires more than just your like input. There's there's what you can do to make sure your plant has the adequate ingredients it needs to survive, but it will also blossom into something that is like grander and bigger than you. And so like I think in inherent in the kind of body as steward model is this appreciation of the spiritual aspect of us, as there's like even if we are trying to steward ourselves well, we will surprise ourselves because we will become more than we even expected to. And that's scary because if we're paying attention to ourselves moment by moment, we might realize where we feel like we are being taken or where we feel like we are being guided to in a day, a week, a month, a year, a decade is different than what we thought we were stewarding ourselves towards. And so, but I also feel like there is kind of this coherence to all of our lives that does make sense, even though, if we're being pulled by whatever word you want to use for intuition, our conscious awareness, like it might seem like, I don't know about for the two of you, but whenever I go to a dinner party, there's always some puzzled looks when I kind of give people the account of my life. They're like, I don't really get it. Like you're doing all these weird things. And in my head, there's some in my head, maybe I'm deceiving myself, but in my head, I like to think there's some convergence there. But I know those are a lot of thoughts, but yeah, just kind of what I've been thinking about.
Well, I enjoyed that all a lot. I mean, just some thoughts that came to mind. It was very interesting as you were speaking with Jung on the addict. And, we talk a lot about willpower, but you almost want to talk about steward power, right? Like, because I'm listening to what Clayton was saying with Levin, and there's a way in which the problem with the will is that's almost like the cell that wants to be an eye going into a foot without communicating to the foot, right? Like to the other community. So it's like, I'm going to will to be an eye, and then the signal from the community, the environment is like, nah, you can't quite do that, right? You have to first communicate with the environment, and then it can change the direction of the cell, right? Likewise, the individual, like, well, I'm going to will not to be addicted anymore, but without any communication to the environment or any work on the environment, well, then it can't form in a new way, right? So you end up falling kind of back, right? Like so much of like we put a lot of willpower on like grit, kind of like as an individual, but we don't, willpower, it's almost like will is meant more for design. Like we're supposed to will in terms of design, not will like we can't will ourselves through something because then we just hit the environment that's forming us a different way, just like in that Levin example, right? So I was just thinking about steward power as you were speaking. I love this paragraph in Clayton's paper that comes to mind. We are living through a crisis of stewardship, the defining malaise of our time, the loneliness epidemic, soaring anxiety and depression, the pervasive sense of meaninglessness. And maybe trees do have, what's that M. Night Shyamalan movie where the trees kill everyone? So I hope they're not having a meaning crisis. I can't remember the name of that one. Our symptoms, to continue, our symptoms of a systematic disruption in this stewardship loop. We are witnessing what can only be called a great ungrooming, a digital algorithmic environment that hijacks the body's prediction machinery, fragments our attention, and starves us of the embodied practices our biology requires. I very much like how you talk about grooming in the paper. I might ask you to talk about that or anything you want to talk about on this fine day. And I like how you're talking about hygiene. And I also like this phrase, to remember, to wash, to move, to sleep, to eat with intention. So you talk about things we need to do. To remember that you are not just living in a body, you are the body's way of caring for itself. I love that idea. You are the body's way of caring for itself. This is so nice because instead of you being real and the body dirty, something you're trying to get out of and some problematic ideas, it's like, no. You are the body's way of caring for itself. So you are the body and not like you have this metacognitive role. And it's interesting to think that actually one of the ways you care for your body is communicating with the environment so your body can be formed properly, right? Like it's just very interesting because it would just seem like the consciousness develops because it's like the only way I can actually care for this body is there needs to be a way of communicating with the environment. Now I'm thinking about language and all of these different things because it goes to Levin's example. Like if I don't talk with the environment, I'm not going to be able to form with it, right? So I need to negotiate with it. And so like the body can't care for itself without a way to communicate with the environment. And then that also makes me think when you start talking about Levin, a cell in your finger doesn't need a blueprint of the entire hand. It just needs to know its relationship to the field, and the field guides it toward the correct form. Well, it's almost as if without consciousness, without you, I might just say you instead of body. Without you can't know, the body can't know the relationship to the field. Like the body requires you to know the relationship to the field. And that seems to be very true. Like no matter what your body does, it doesn't know what Aunt Martha's thinking. It doesn't know about capitalism. It doesn't know about the system, right? It doesn't know about its relationship to the field. I'd be curious, any thoughts at all on anything, Clayton? Those are just thoughts, and I love everything Michael was sharing.
Oh my God, it's there's a lot. There's a lot. I have like where to start. So while you're all sharing that, I was taken back to there's a conversation on OG Rose, Michelle, Sam Green, and I think a couple of other ladies were talking about, I don't remember what the theme was, but they were having a conversation. If you go back to OG Rose, you'll find that conversation. So while watching one of those, and I think it was Sam Green who was emphasizing this, like she articulated that every now and then, like, if you're the mother in the home, you can like go to the father and ask them to mow the lawn. And they'll say something like, well, I will. It's on my list of things, but I don't reckon like I need to do that right now. And she tries to articulate like, well, if I had to articulate why I particularly asked for this in that moment, because when I was walking outside and I felt the humidity and I saw the cloud, I sensed that it could rain soon, and therefore now was the opportune time to mow the lawn. It's a bit much, and so it kind of like becomes very difficult to articulate within language and bring these things forth. And so, you're talking about communication, so that came back to me. But the thing that really came out of it was how we're living you'd say in the three, for me, it's kind of like the three aspects of time. Yeah, I mean, like we're always so aware of, of the chronos, but the kairos and then the eon. So it's like we're always being pulled to, or we're acting in those three ways at all times. And I guess, you go to the Trinity, it's kind of like, yeah, there's always three versions of you at any one point. Yeah. And so why is this coming up? Because it's like we always have to be anticipating and correlating with the now. It's like we have to, the memory problem, right? Like we have to keep remembering the memory, right? Both from what happened and what's going to happen. And we're in a chaotic environment where every other entity is doing that all at once. And so communication is really key. And if you're not able to break through to the others, then there's going to be conflict. Then it's not going to harmonize. Then it's not going to sync. But this also says, it brings me to these experiments that they've recently developed the technology for a flying car, right? But it's hard to implement because it doesn't fit the design, right? It's like, yeah, flying car sounds like a great idea, but it's a mix of concepts because in our current, progression of civilization, a car is a thing that moves on the ground. We have created a space for it, and it works a specific way. Like all the rules are so clear. Like when you go to that space in a thing called a car, it just works. Now you're wanting to change the behavior and make that fly. Do you need a flying license for a car? These were actual questions. Like, are you going to need like a pilot's license? It's like, no, it's a car. It's like, what kind of license do you use? Do you use a driving license or a flying license? Do we have to make a new license for someone who has to fly the car? And so there's all these questions. And so right now, all these prototypes in all the cities, I think in China, they're trying it out in a couple of cities. They're trying to do it in Dubai. And they're trying it out here in Australia, but Australia shut it down. They say, well, you can buy one, but you can't use it because we haven't created room for it. Like we have to change the legalities. We have to account for all these other ways our world works now to fit in this new component, which is the same thing. If you want to build an eye on the foot, you got to solve all those problems at all those levels because it's really disruptive. It's good, but it has to cohere with everything else. And which now brings me to the placebo effect, right? So every now and then, this has been a big mystery, and I think they're still researching it. Like, why does the placebo effect work? And I think it's because of the communication. It's like, if you're convinced that this has to happen, that's all that needs to happen. Like you have to just be convinced, right? You don't really need the medication. You just need convincing. So, but the convincing is hard. That's the whole Jordan Peterson gripe about belief, right? Like, yeah, it is hard. You have to be convinced is to believe, like to really live it out and as though it's true. And so if you actually live it out as though it's true, I guess it becomes a reality, which goes to what Michael was saying, that the spiritual aspect of it. It's like you have to communicate at that level. And I guess to sum it all up, it's like once that whole alignment has happened within you, with you, and beyond you, and it's all together, then there's no more need to. It's kind of like we have to work towards the point of exhausting communication. It's like to saturate the need for communication. It's like once we saturate the need for communication, then whatever needs to happen happens in a sense. But there's a lot of work to do because we're always, sort of like being pulled in different directions, and at each locality, the reality is different, and the problems to solve for are different at each level. And so, if you're not trying to intentionally be in alignment, it even makes it harder. So yeah, it's a tough job. And I guess like if we take the stewardship approach, it sort of helps, because then if you accept that, well, I guess I have to be a bit more clear. I need to be a bit more intentional about making this happen, or trying to achieve this objective. It reduces the unnecessary friction, the unnecessary conflict of what you may have to fight with, and sort of like it's one less battle, but there's like a million of them. And so I guess 999,000 battles is better than a million. Right? I'll pass it back.
Oh, I'm now thinking about the placebo effect. Oh my goodness. Oh, I love how you brought that. So very interesting. So first, it should be noted, like, you talk about in the paper, on the idea of, systems, the pattern that repeats. So on this kind of idea that, your heart, this way of this kind of gathering complexity. And you talk about how with Levin, cells create and respond to bioelectric fields that function as a kind of collective intelligence. These fields contain the information cells need to know where they are in the body and that they should become, and you've already mentioned that, right? Well, then you also talk about, but it doesn't stop there either. You say some more, your cardiovascular system, your digestive system, your immune system, each in itself is a network of organs working towards systematic goals, and these system twos must coordinate with each other, right? So there's an interesting sort of idea that I'm going to break it down into three ways that is overly simplistic, so forgive me. But there's this repeating pattern of, dare I say, I'll just say the unit, the collective, and then I want to say, we'll just stick with communication, right? So there's the unit and the collective. And when the unit successfully communicates with the collective and the collective successfully communicates with the unit doesn't have to know everything the collective is doing. And the collective doesn't actually need to know everything about the unit. It nevertheless is able to organize into something more complex, right? And this pattern can repeat on and on at different levels, right? So it's, unit collective communication. And what's very interesting is that there seemingly becomes a point where consciousness is needed to coordinate, to communicate between the, say, unit and the collective, the body and the environment, or other bodies, et cetera, so forth, right? There's some sort of coordination that is going on there. Now, the first things that come to mind too is when you were speaking with Sam Green's example on this idea that, I've talked with her about there's rationality that is calculation, which is more, and then there's the feminine that she'll talk about in her, the story of the mermaid, on the idea of apprehension, where you're able to just apprehend it's going to rain. Like, you see the painting and you get it. You just apprehend that's a circle. You don't count when you recognize a circle. You don't calculate to the circle. You just apprehend that's a circle. Like I apprehend that's about bookcase. I didn't calculate. I just apprehend it as a bookcase, right? Now, calculation is when you start sort of breaking things apart to determine the best plan, like the best timing, allocation, and stuff like that, right? And it would seem like a successful system. So now I'm thinking Lumen and kind of cybernetics and society and different things. Like what you need for a successful marriage and society is seemingly communication between apprehension, non-rational, and calculation, rational. And that if you're able to successfully communicate between those two, then you can have a functioning environment. But if you can't, then when, apprehension shows up in an environment of calculation, then the calculation tries to form it into calculation, and that's not too good, right? Or the apprehension kind of creates chaos, like it's not able to be intelligible to it, so the system doesn't work, right? So there has to be a way of communicating between the apprehension and the calculation for a higher complexity, right? But how do you engage in that communication? Because the apprehender is going to use the communication in terms of apprehension, and the calculator is going to use calculation in terms of, well, they're going to communicate in terms of calculation, right? See, in the example Sam gave, the female there is going to try to explain in terms of apprehension. The other person is going to explain in terms of calculation, and they're going to talk past one another, right? Well, whenever you have two things talking past one another, the only hope you have is a metacognition that can see over them, right? So eventually you get an impasse, it would seem like, right? You get a kind of impasse. And once you get that impasse, you now need a meta dimension to actually move through that, right? And that's where, like, whenever you have a new complexity, like perhaps a new social complexity, and I would certainly say that a lot of work now in philosophy is indeed a kind of metacognition of thinking itself. Like there's a kind of like a way that thinking operates in different ways, in different registers, according to different epistemologies at different time. Like there's an increasing kind of awareness that rationality and non-rationality are not the same, that apprehension and calculation are different, that meaning and efficiency are different, right? And you could fold this under simply the metacognition of consciousness, but it almost seems to be, it's almost more of a metacognition about thinking, like the category. It's like on the categories of thinking themselves, right? That you're actually, by trying to figure out how to make them communicate, give rise to newer complexity. And I would argue this is the complexity of a successful global pluralism, that if we don't figure out, we're in huge trouble, basically. I'm also now thinking about the social coordination mechanism, what we're doing here on YouTube, Zoom, the stuff we've talked about, like net, like where we're coordinating around the world, that this is indeed actually an infrastructure of communication so that units can figure out how to work with collectives that are uniquely pluralistic, uniquely different, right? That's a very high challenge to actually have units not be rejected by the collectives, right? So there's like a new skill set that is needed in that. Before I keep talking, I did want to note though, I'm now thinking about stuff like, so maybe positive thinking, like with the placebo. So maybe positive thinking, because there's always this mystery of why is it people that are positive thinking, like it does seem like that actually helps, right? Like negativity, like literally kills you. Well, maybe positive thinking works when it successfully negotiates with the environment or communicates with the environment somehow. Like the question is, what is that environment? Could be a spiritual environment. It could be the mental environment where there are voices in your head. Like, is there a point? And maybe prayer. Maybe prayer is some sort of successful negotiation with some kind of environment, right? And you're suddenly figuring out how to make the unit fit with the collective, right? Maybe because there's always this idea of why there's this like, oh, don't be so positive, you're being naive. But there does seem to be something about positivity that actually seems to have an actual practical impact sometimes, but not always, right? Same with prayer. Prayer seems to work sometimes, but not always. Perhaps it is because this is where the stewardship model might be very useful, because positive thinking, prayer, this sort of stuff has to be a successful negotiation with an environment, not just a blind wish fulfillment. It has to be tied to some sort of successful negotiation with some sort of collective or environment. What exactly would probably get into the specifics of what the prayer is and the positive thinking is about, but that seems to be like the more it's like stewardship that is like positive thinking, placebo prayer, all of those things that are tied to a stewardship model, as opposed to a kind of mysterious ghost in the machine model, might start kind of unpacking when it is useful, when it is not, and why, right? So I'm thinking about, I will stop and throw it to Michael here to talk about anything at all. Michael.
Well, it's got me thinking about a lot. I was on a call today with some friends. We're doing this New Testament project that we've been uploading our conversations on YouTube. And this time we were talking about Paul's letters. And so, we were talking a lot about 1 Corinthians 13, about the indispensability of love. And Paul talks about, he kind of warns against, because he was observing all these people in Corinth who were speaking in tongues. right? But he was observing that they weren't really loving. Like they weren't really loving each other. They were kind of retreating to this kind of sacred power of, you know, communing with the angels. But I think he says something like speaking in tongues without love is kind of pointless. Um, and so this communion with, you know, kind of consecrating um the inner dialogue with the environment. You know, it makes me think of William Blake says prayer is the study of art, which I just think is great. I just love that. Um, because art is inherent, you know, like inherent to it is this attempt to communicate with the environment. Like that is the artistic process, is kind of bringing one's internal experience into dialogue with, you know, the great conversation. And I think that's why it's so necessary, if you want to engage with art, to study it, to you know, if you're going to be a writer, to read, if you're going to be a painter, to, you know, observe and mimic the great painters before you know, kind of go out on your own, because it you're ingesting all of this vocabulary that you can then use to shape your own kind of understanding of that, and that continues to yeah, like evolve yourself. um and so, you know, I think, but then there's, you know, then there's a delicate balance of like, a lot of people, you know, get turned off to you know, classic ways of uh training in the arts, because then it just becomes all about, you know, mimicry and studying, and there isn't that emphasis on, okay, the creation, right? The like the the kind of embodied sense of taking in information and then actually, you know, creating something new out of it. um but yeah, I mean, that's um that was definitely something that I was thinking about as I was reading this paper, and then just kind of in light of the things that I've been thinking about recently with addiction, and kind of how like the dislocation, like one of the authors in one of the books that I'm reading talks about dislocation, this kind of the fragmenting of society, where people become, you know, closer and closer to like worlds onto themselves, and then that kind of breeds this impulse to reach for substances that will kind of, you know, numb that feeling of isolation. Um and when people don't have the spaces to work through their own experience, they perceive the outside world to be this kind of like vacuous void. And I was talking about in one of my posts, because someone was talking about how trauma, and this is uh you know, very much in line with your work, Daniel, like trauma hijacks your memory and your executive functioning. And, you know, in periods of depression and anxiety, I felt like I'm living in like a timeless, like kind of like a post-time world. I don't exactly know how to describe it, but like I it didn't feel like I really understood where I like my present in the context of my past, and what future I was moving towards in the context of my present. That I was kind of just like this kind of floating entity, and I wasn't really tethered anywhere. Um and like the ability to have this embodied stewardship uh sense of presence, you know, it like it connects you to memory, and it doesn't just connect you to your own memories of your own biography, but it connects you, I think, to something more fundamental, of like memories of what it feels to be fundamentally human, you know, like um I think even people um who have scarcely felt joy in their life, like if they can process, trauma and be able to experience the present, it's like they almost have this like instinctual feeling of what and kind of and orientation towards that, as like this is like a fundamental um human human inclination towards these things. um yeah, so that's just kind of what your thoughts brought up, Daniel. But yeah, there's something about art and creativity that seems to be kind of alive in this conversation as well.
Well, I would just go just a few things. First, I'm very interested in what you're saying with tongues, because it's like, there's always this weird tension with like spiritual things like tongues and et cetera. So Pentecostal we'll talk about it. It's kind of like, and I think what Paul is saying there is like the unit cannot do something unless it is communicated to the community what's going on, unless it can be translated. So it's interesting if there's because I think Paul basically says tongues are okay, just make sure there's a translator, and if there's not a translator, that's no good. And then it's really interesting because it's like, and if there's not a translator, it can't be in love. Like it's almost like it can't be. It has to be more egoic, which is very interesting to suggest there's something about love and communication that goes together, right? And people in relationships can attest that love and communication do indeed go together, right? Well, that would make sense. And also there's always this emphasis in religions and different things on love. Well, what is love but kind of the negotiation between the unit and the other, the unit and the collective, to make kind of community possible, right? And there's a way in which when you have the I cell that shows up in the foot and there's no communication, there's no love, there can't be love because there can't be understanding, right? And even if you want to accept the I, like even if you wanted to, you can't. There's like a form there that doesn't allow it, right? So there has to be kind of communication. And that's funny to think like creation can't occur without that communication, right? Like in the beginning was the word. I've heard it said that in the beginning was the word can be translated as in the beginning was the conversation. I think Cleo has marked that. I really like that. And it's funny to say, like, if the conversation is actually like the coordination of the unit with the community, and therefore the possibility of love, and nothing can be created or formed otherwise. That's interesting to think. There may be better language than unit. That's what I'm using here, so forgive me. But it's almost like creation is the successful communication between a unit and a community. Like if a unit and a community can successfully communicate, then you get creation, right? And that seems to be what occurs, like looking at your paper again, that seems to be what occurs whenever you get some sort of systemic coherence. Like whenever you get some sort of successful complexity, then units have successfully communicated with the collective and the collective with the unit to actually cohere in a way that it makes a new complexity happen. And none of the parties need to know what that complexity is going to be. As you say, all they need to know is their role in the field, right? Like that's all they need to do, and then that gives you complexity. And I think that's very, very true. And here's the crucial point: at the level of organization, the pattern is the same. Cells coordinate to build organs. Organs coordinate to build systems. Systems coordinate to build what? So, if the pattern is unit, communication, collective, then if we take global pluralism to be a system, then it will require communication somehow. And I would actually argue before the social coordination mechanism, this use of the internet, not just as content, but coordination, it was actually not possible for any sort of successful communication between the unit and the collective. And so now, who knows what can occur, right? I think also I just wanted to read this other part here where, when systemic coherence reaches a certain threshold of complexity, when the coordination problems become too multifaceted for reflective response alone, something new must emerge. The body needs a meta-level coordinator. It needs something that can anticipate threats before they arrive, plan responses that span multiple timescales, navigate social environments that change faster than genetics can track, learn from experience and update predictions accordingly, make trade-offs between competing systemic needs. This meta-level coordinator is what we experience as conscious awareness, the you, right? So there's this idea that there comes a point when you need that. So the question now, kind of looking at a systems level, because my brain always goes there, is So it would almost seem as if nation states need a meta level coordinator, right? Like that the globe actually is heading. And you could say that the meta level coordinator of states were governments or societies. And now it's almost as if you need a meta level coordination between different governments, right? And, that's kind of the idea of the UN or whatever. But the problem is, here's the issue, something like the UN, you could argue is a rationality of calculation. And we said earlier that you need to be able to coordinate between apprehension and calculation. And so what has happened is basically UN efforts have tried to make the world according to a technocrat. It has therefore made everyone feel like reduced into technology, transhumanism, and all the other stuff that gets into the fun. But there's an idea that it's kind of like the powers that be are functioning as a kind of meta level coordinator, but they're stuck in the logic of calculation, right? And the success of a cybernetic system, and when I say cybernetic there, I'm just thinking kind of tealism. Yes, I love it, Michael. I'm thinking Lumen there, is seemingly successful communication between apprehension and calculation, right? And it would almost seem like online with the social coordination mechanism, we're doing a kind of grassroots movement of globally diverse people in the name of apprehension. Like, I think we're training apprehension in this space more than calculation, but you need, it's always both, of course. And that needs to then kind of offset the out of balanceness, I suppose, of an emphasis on calculation, and that you need a people that can actually successfully communicate with those who are emphasizing calculation with apprehension, or else the system is going to end up not being able to form. Like, the people will not be able to be formed by the state. There's going to be a mismatch because they can't communicate with one another. But then likewise, the state is going to function in a main that just basically kind of bulldozes the possibility of the unit forming into anything different. So I'm thinking about all of this on kind of a global pluralistic level. I love this paper. I have more notes, but I'll just throw it to Clayton to talk about anything. Clayton.
No, fantastic. Yeah, I love how it's all coming together, like, to our usual net language. I think it's been heavily influenced by that as well. But yeah, I'm loving this. And I just wanted to touch on what Michael shared earlier about, addiction. And I think I use an example close to it in the paper around the cake eating. I think, was it cake or chocolate? I think it was chocolate. Yeah, it was chocolate. Yeah. So it's fascinating because, before I elaborate on that, there's a part there when you're talking about the calculation and apprehension. It reminded me of obviousness. It's like, what do we do once we know how the space should work? Take a road, right? Like, we've worked out the rules. We've decided what the white lines mean, what the yellow lines mean. The zebra crossing, the lights. All these systems have been put in place, and now we know how it should work. So the calculation has been done. So now we just apply it apprehensively. So we just know. It's like, oh, no. We just look at it and it speaks to us, right? It's like all this calculation is building a language that will be consumed in apprehension, right? It's a preparation. And even thinking about it, it's like, it's symbolic. It's very slow. It's sort of trying to set up what is going to be required for analogy to work, right? Like, because we operate analogically, not calculatively, and analogy is really fast. Like, it's really quick. You just see it and you don't need to walk through the step by step and all the calculation. It's like the calculation must have been done a long time ago for the apprehension to happen. And so, like you're saying, they go together. And what happens when it's done right, the outcome is obviousness, right? It's like, it just becomes obvious. And then there's less being stuck in trying to fine tune what the obviousness should be, because now the obviousness is agreed. And so it's kind of like the end point, like the completion of that complexity. And now we can move on to the next level of complexity. And it keeps repeating, and it keeps repeating. And I guess like you require a lot of time and a lot of hard work to start building the next the next obviousness. You have to do all the calculation, the slow calculation, and put in place, define the symbols, build the language, and make it all cohere. And when it coheres, then we end that level of complexity and then move to the next one. And it doesn't stop. It's just going to keep going. But all of this because if you don't have the obviousness, then it's sort of like really we get trapped, we get stuck. And I guess that this is what happens in the in the scenario of addiction, right? Like it's like you conflate, and then you start apprehending something in a way that it's not meant to be apprehended. There's some weird conflation, some weird confusion. And in the example I use with the chocolate, it's like you spiritually have an appetite for chocolate, like you just love it. And I use chocolate because I really like chocolate. However, chocolate as a source of nutrients is not successful. Like it does not do well on the scale of nutrients required to run a human body. And so, but you still need to solve those problems, right? Like you still need to meet the need of chocolate and the need of sustaining a human body. So if you're not aware of this, if you don't apprehend these together, what are you going to do? Have a box of chocolate for lunch, right? And for some reason you do not feel satiated. Like it's very temporal, and you kind of feel like I think I solved it. Like I just had a lot of what I desired. But some part of me still feels like I need more. Do I get more chocolate? And it's like, yeah, you try that, it doesn't end well, right? And so you have this weird enigma. But actually what you need is the need that is still left is the need for the nutrients that you are meant to have provided. Like, that, as a steward who has to go out there and find food for this machinery that operates on this fuel, it has a specific kind of fuel. If you're giving it, the wrong fuel, you're just causing more problems. Anyone who drives a car, well, I can't say that anymore. Times have changed. Anyone who drives a motorized engine car that either consumes diesel or petrol would know this. If you mix up your diesel and your petrol, yeah, there's going to be problems, right? I guess in the version of the electric version, you just have one one kind of fuel, so it doesn't matter where you consume it from. It all works the same way, which is an upgrade, I guess. It's an upgrade, but there's also things lost. But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But yeah, coming back to the addiction, I think you get trapped in trying to satiate the spiritual need, and I think it's very spiritual. Like you mentioned, Michael, with that patient of Jung being asked to go do something spiritual. Yeah, you do have spiritual needs that you have to satiate, and I guess like if you look at John Vervaeke's work, all this meaning crisis, like yeah, there's a huge gap in the spiritual realm. Like, but why? It's like, well, if you go back to Peterson, yeah, Nietzsche, God is dead, and all of that. It's like, but if God is dead and we don't need them, why do we have this weird spiritual gap now that we're having to deal with? And yeah, it's like, yeah, it all starts to make sense together. And yeah, so we have to continually work on building up what is going to be required to satiate that complexity. And it's hard. It's language building, and that's why the work you guys are doing, Daniel and Michelle, on writing, teaching people how to write, I think it's fantastic. It's very timely. We all need to do this. We need to learn how to language. it's because the writing is the practice of building the language and exercising, like extending language is a hard job. It's really hard. But without a language, it's harder to live without language. So I guess we just have to do it. Anyways, I'll pass it back.
I love you, and thank you for the support on the writing. Good man, writing and all of that. We believe in that strongly. So there's a few things. I'll throw it to Michael. So first, it's very interesting because it's just like, you know, I was listening to the woman who runs the Alpha Schools, which is fascinating. Michelle and I are very interested by the Alpha School program. You know, there's this idea that if you have a student that's failing, you could say it's the student's fault, or you can say it's our fault. Like teachers choose that, right? It's like the teachers are like, well, we need to be doing something different. And a lot what she was saying with the Alpha School is they say it's our fault if the student is not interested, right? So it goes with addiction. You can say, well, it's their fault, or you can say, well, it's our fault for creating an environment where addiction would be something that people want to do, right? You choose, right? And what's just very interesting is there's a way in which I'm now you know, so you have that eye cell that's put in the foot, and the foot doesn't want it. And so the cell, you know, does drugs. The eye cell does drugs because it can't, you know, that's the only way to deal with that situation, right? And so likewise, is it something where too, like we find units, like we're putting units in situations where they can't communicate to coordinate with the world. And so they can't get formed, or they're trying to be formed into something that they're not. And there's this mix and the only way to deal with that tension is to do drugs. The hikikomori. Right? And there's a way in which, yeah, is not so much of the hikikomori or the numbing a certain communication problem, a certain sort of coordination problem, a certain sort of inability to coordinate successfully with the environment so that it can form you with it, form you into it, right? And what you end up getting is feeling like, I don't belong here. Yeah, you don't, eye cell, you don't belong here. And there hasn't been communication to the foot cells to ask them nicely, hey, you think you can let that eye cell do its thing? Because we don't know how to communicate. And it's very interesting here to be stressing communication as something ontological, really, like something deeper than merely information exchange. It is the coordination of form, like form and coordination. And because it is also very interesting, you know, I know Levin will talk about the Platonic, and the word Platonic means many things to many people, but this kind of idea that there is some sort of form that is not reducible to, well, shape or materiality, that materiality seems to follow almost like a bowling gutter is a way I've described it with Matthew Allison. You know, if your ball ends up in the gutter, it follows it, or like a track the marble goes on, right? It's almost as if there are kind of ontological gutters in reality, for good and for bad, that things can kind of follow, right? And it's almost as if without communication, we cannot locate those gutters, or we can't find the gutter that we can come together with. And complexity occurs successfully when there's a successful communication to a gutter, to a form, actually. And then the field almost seems to do the rest for it, if you will, right? But this would make communication the very space of agency then, because it determines if you find that or not, right? Like freedom is actually found in successful communication in this deeper ontological sense, right? Like we tend to locate freedom in choice, which we've talked about is the mistake of modern liberalism, is that choice equals freedom. No, you know, freedom is in a choice, which is actually a loss of choice because it's a commitment. But you find freedom in something. Isaiah Berlin talks about freedom to and freedom from. I think there's a third, freedom in. And really what we long for is freedom in something. But communication is a kind of ontological coordination to the possibility of freedom in something. Unless, now here's the issue. When there were givens, the likelihood that the unit would, you know, that the likelihood the unit would be a foot cell in a foot was high. So you didn't need communicate. It would match, right? Because there were givens, right? But if you remove givens, then you could be an eye cell ending up in a community of foot cells, right? So looking at Levin's work, the only way to deal with that is quote unquote communication, right? So in a global pluralistic world without the quote unquote without givens, unless you're going to try to go back to givens, which is very dangerous, but that's belonging again, you're going to have to learn to communicate, actually. Like communication becomes huge, right? and we don't know how to talk. And in fact, we're getting worse at it, you could argue. And so this is bad. And also, I would argue you haven't had a infrastructure to allow communication that is needed properly with global pluralism. That would be the social coordination mechanism that we're now working on. So yeah, addiction could be tied to eye cells and foots that don't want it. I think also there's something about this kind of ontological communication that is creation, because there always is a kind of question, like what, because I'm just thinking of what Michael was saying as I throw sticky notes everywhere, is that like there's this idea that there's something about art and creation here. Like there's always this question of when does the artist create versus simply arrange, right? Like, you could say like very often the artist, like if they're just arranging or causing things, like what's the difference between causation and creation? Right? That's always kind of a mysterious thing. Someone like Berjaev is like, only God creates because only God does ex nihilo. Everyone else is just basically causing and arranging and so on and so forth, right? And there's some degree of truth to that. But there's also an idea that you actually kind of do create versus just arrange when you're able to successfully coordinate with the unit to give rise to complexity. If there's a complexity, that is a creation, actually. So creation requires, because complexity is irreducible. It's always not reducible to what made it, right? And also complexity is something that if you took apart, you can't put back together. The difference between complex and complicated is a complicated thing can be taken apart and put back together. A complex thing cannot be taken apart without it being lost, right? Like I can take an engine apart and put it back together. It's complicated, but the human body, if I take it apart, it dies. I can never put the human body back together. It's complex, right? So whenever you generate something complex, that is arguably an act of creation because it is irreducible. It may not be ex nihilo, but I would say it's ex lac, actually, alluding to Mr. Jockin's work, because it's being made out of the lack of the thing. But to be cheeky for a moment, is that actually in lack is form, of course. Is that actually complexity is creation. And complexity seems to be when a unit successfully communicates with a community, quote unquote, right? So if we want creation in global pluralism, versus death and stuff, we would need units to be able to communicate with the collective so that people could form into one another, which could possibly generate a new complexity. I want to read more stuff out of your paper because like every section is gorgeous. But I was also going to say, I love this. I will read this section and then I'll throw it to Michael or anyone. I love this part with the virtuous cycle and the vicious cycle. You can't see it, but this part is great. It makes me think of the addiction stuff, right? Because like so much, and actually I think so much of stewardship is about making sure your body is not in a bad freaking feedback loop. So much of life is the feedback loop problem. Like choose good feedback loops, not to like we think too much. I'm screaming. We think too much in terms of good choices. This is not, no. Think in terms of good feedback loops or bad feedback loops. That's what you really want to pay attention to. There are good choices that lead to bad feedback loops and things that look like bad choices that actually lead to good feedback loops, right? So always keep your eye on the ball. The ball is the feedback loop, ladies and gentlemen. Keep your eye on the freaking feedback loop. And I think like what ends up happening is actually many meaning crisis, addictions, and so on and so forth, is when the society has collectively made decisions that get it in a negative feedback loop, actually, that then it can't get out of. Now, that would have to be justified, but I do think that occurs. I love also what you say, bodily coherence enables consciousness. Consciousness maintains conditions for its own substrate, top down, and then you get a feedback loop, not a circle between them. I think that's glorious. I think something similar seems to occur on the social level between the units of global pluralism and global pluralism as a whole. But unfortunately, we have basically not figured out yet, because we can't communicate, how to coordinate global pluralism in terms of a virtuous cycle versus a freaking vicious cycle. And that's the challenge now. And that is fundamental. And actually, what I think is really important with this conversation that's being highlighted, I think often people think the problem with global pluralism, because that's always my obsession, gentlemen. I'm sorry, I had to bring it in. Is that everyone thinks the problem of global pluralism. There's a lot of questions being asked. Okay, so do we need like new institutions, new governments, new businesses, or so on and so forth, right? Well, looking at Clayton's work and indeed looking at Levin's, et cetera, so forth, then basically the address of global pluralism, you would put the communication first, and then the institutions would come out of that. Because new institutions, because here's the question, like if you're saying like, do we need new institutions? Well, if there are institutions like the ones we had, those failed. right? They were not successful coordinating mechanisms, right? So actually what you're saying, when you say, do we need new institutions, you're saying we need new, more complex institutions. That's actually what you're saying. You need more complex institutions, right? Well, what we are discussing here is that complexity comes from out of successful communication between unit and collective, not the complexity first, right? Like you don't do the institution first, and then it's the successful communication then generates the complexity, right? And so I think that, and I would actually argue that, you know, in my own bias with the great enrichment, Dietrich McCloskey, Hayek, and all these other cats, say, yeah, it's actually a change in rhetoric, as he put it, that first. Well, actually, I'm glad actually, now that I'm talking, Dietrich McCloskey is huge for all this, because he, I think, would agree with this thesis that actually it's a change in rhetoric and values that creates enrichment and new society first, and then you get the new institutions, actually. It's a change in like rhetoric is exactly what he calls it in her book. And then, of course, the Frankfurt School is, well, we talk about in this belonging, and is always warning that it's discourse that structures consciousness toward its oppression, like a Kafka novel, right? So the language literally structures subjectivity either into a Kafka novel or a great enrichment, right? So if that's the case, I think the stewardship model that is being presented here also provides further evidence that this is the case. And if it is so, we really need to focus on successful communication today in global pluralism. And I do think that is what the social coordination mechanism is doing from my own bias. But then I guess I'm still talking, the thing I'm thinking about as well, like you were pointing out with calculation and this actually was really important that you were saying, the movement into obviousness. That there's a certain point where actually, like, if calculation and apprehension work properly together, something becomes a kind of obviousness that is the new foundation, and you go on from there, right? Okay, so I would say what happens is you get a kind of the game is always a creation of a no knowledge proof, always, because a no knowledge proof is very democratic. Everyone can see it, and we would agree, right? And a no knowledge proof, which is something you would believe without any proof, like you see it and you get it. There's no convincing that's needed. Please note that we exist in a world that's trying to convince everyone. That's energy intensive. It will never succeed. Also, you run up almost into forms of the halting problem, like because you can always communicate more and calculate more and more and give more evidence, and you never know if that's just going to be an infinite loop or arrive. And so you're kind of stuck, right? Always chasing down rabbit holes, and you don't know if you go anywhere or something like that, right? So what you actually need is an apprehension that creates a no knowledge proof. Oh, that overcomes the energy use of endless calculation, right? Because now I apprehend something, right? So this is the key. Calculation must lead to an apprehension, or it's going to be infinite. It's going to be an infinite regress and burnout, right? If it's apprehension, then calculation, it goes on forever and dies. It runs out of energy, right? So we've actually, as a society, in my opinion, been either using calculation to calculate to an end, which you can never get there, right? You can never achieve it because you can never arrive at, yes, AI. You can never arrive at a no knowledge proof, right? You don't arrive at a no, like you like via calculation. Now, I would argue, I guess what I want to say is calculation is in service of determining the highest probability of an apprehension. Like this is the space where an apprehension can occur. This is how we make a space where apprehension can occur. And that's where calculation is very important. But calculation leads to apprehension, or else you never get a new basis. You never get a common ground because we don't apprehend something together that's then obvious, right? So I would argue a main reason why global pluralism is in massive trouble is people are not using calculation in service of getting us all to arrive in an apprehension. We're all trying to calculate what is right and then convince everyone else that is the right. And if not, they're just stupid and irrational, right? So instead of like using calculation to actually figure out how to bring people to apprehension, to thus make something obvious, and quote unquote non-zero sum, and then you have a new common foundation, we're just doing calculation and it never ends and everyone's exhausted and there's no time, energy, or anything. Yeah, because calculation is infinite. It has a halting problem kind of thing going on, right? So I think also like, and you could argue that basically GDP number go up, higher growth is better, right? That's calculation problem, right? Government, nothing can stop growing, right? Yeah, of course not, because it's not growing to an apprehension. It's not growing to like a experience of something. So it just becomes, as Alex Ebert would kind of say, cancerous or something like that, right? So I guess what I'm also saying is because there's not successful communication between, let me put it this way, I'll just say it this way, the global state on the side of Nick Land, AI, singularity stuff, technocrat, calculation, there's not a successful communication between that and the social coordination mechanism working on apprehension, then because that is not there, then you're not able to steward the relation properly from a metacognitive position. I got stuck on cognitive there. It was funny how I tried to say it. Then what ends up happening is that they're not able to produce complexity. Actually, you get a vicious cycle instead of a virtuous cycle, as you talk about in the paper. And there's going to have to need to be that communication between those two, or else all of the calculation, all of the growth, all of the number go up of GDP, all of these different frames will never arrive at an apprehension. And then thus it will not be able to bring everyone together into a new obviousness. And it's also kind of funny to think about stewardship as kind of trying to arrive at new obviousness. Like, what you're trying to do is once you like groom yourself, you say, oh, it's obvious I need to groom myself. Once you like actually successfully communicate with the society and your family, you go, oh, it's obvious that I need to take care of these things. And it is kind of funny as I think about it, and not to Michael to say anything. I think I said that 20 minutes ago. You're such a saint. Is that like it is funny that becoming an adult is more and more of just stuff becoming obvious to you. Like you're like, yes, you don't have to think about it anymore. You just know it. You apprehend it. It's not something you calculate anymore, right? And so like funny enough, there's a way in which like younger, you're using a whole lot of calculation to determine what's good and bad and different things. But as you get older, you have, experience. And what is experience other than apprehension? And now you don't have to think about it anymore. So there's a kind of grace in it. Like that's where trial and error, because that was coming up. That's where trial and error seems kind of important, because you actually then don't have to calculate anymore. You had the error, so you know it don't work, so you apprehend it, so it saves you mental energy, right? And so it's kind of interesting how maturity kind of corresponds with a certain obviousness. And it's almost as if on a systems level, on the level of global pluralism, we're at a place where global pluralism is not able to reach any obvious plateaus per se. Like it's not able to reach anything that is now obvious to us. So it always feels like it's chaos because things are falling through and we're recalculating things and rethinking it. Like there's no arrival on something that's now obvious that then we can hold us, right? And I almost now am kind of like, as we're speaking, coordinating, like thinking about successful coordination between units and communities as the establishment of new obviousness that can then collectively hold us together, right? On higher levels of complexity, and we have not figured out how to do that in terms of global pluralism. Michael.
I never know when the mic's going to be dropped. I kind of always, I always have to stay ready. I always have to be on the starting blocks. I am afraid I probably will have to go soon. I'm hearing the clanking of cutlery being set out, which means dinner is not far behind. But yeah, there's a lot that you said there, Daniel, around apprehension as opposed to calculation, and a sort of kind of shining forth of the next clear thing to do that seems to come with maturity. So sometimes I've kind of noticed that like the people that appear to be the most mature and the most grounded to me, there's kind of a like a simpleness or like a clarity in their speech that sometimes I can, maybe because it always seems like I'm wrestling with something. I perceive that as kind of being like a simpleton, like, oh, like there's kind of a lack of conflict in your life that kind of means like, oh, you're not like you're not like really grappling with things that, maybe you're kind of just glossing over the complexity of life. Which I certainly think that can be the case. And I think one positive thing of the pluralistic age that we live in is that you do have to contend with nuance in a way that you've never really had to previously. But there also is like a sense in which if you are really mature, you can kind of parse out all of the noise and see the signal, uh very apparently, and it is kind of this like, yeah, that's not good for me, that is good for me, and that's, and there is kind of that clarity in that. So I think that's very good, and I think that is definitely a feature of the the well stewarded body, is that ability to pick up on what it is that your body and your mind and your soul really need, and actually how to meet that well. Um, I think there's something else, Daniel, you said in the kind of the cancer, as Ebert was talking about. This week I was reflecting in my post on the war on drugs. Is I kind of put things into my head that might be really obvious to everyone else, but I was thinking about how after World War II, when the Cold War started, one of the main metaphors or analogies that the US was using to justify the anti-communist movement is describing communism as a cancer. And that's why we went to Vietnam, because they were like, well, communism is here in this little country in Vietnam, but it's going to spread. And if we don't nip it in the bud, it's going to proliferate throughout all of Asia. And then it's just going to continue to spread and to spread. And before we know it, it's going to be our, our neighbors are going to be, reading the Communist Manifesto or whatever. And so there was this rhetoric that like positioned something as, um, a disease and needing to be rooted out. And I kind of just connected the dots of how that in that time, how that was applied to so many different things. Like the HIV/AIDS epidemic was seen as like the gay disease, and what was it, Reagan and other presidents like denied funding to support research and care for it, because they thought it was just happening to homosexuals and blacks, and like um the police brutality on blacks and minorities was kind of there was kind of this like a label and attachment of black criminals being cancerous to society, things like that. And so going back to like the rhetoric before institutions, it's like, yeah, if there whatever rhetoric is being used is going to shape the institutions, and then the feedback loop, then the institutions reinforce the rhetoric, and then people, yeah, they feel stuck in that. And that just makes me think about how language, and I think there's a case to be made that like um flourishing can only happen when there's language and the right spaces being cultivated. There's kind of, it's kind of hard in a war-torn country, even if you're having a net-like conversation, for that to really bring about change, because there's still a paranoia and a threat of survival and all this. But I think language is it's like resistant to environments, like, and I think it's like the antidote to the great displacement that many of us experience. Like I've just seen it for myself. Like I've moved. This is now I'm about to move this next weekend, and it's gonna be my third move in 6 months. And it's like, and I've moved, I don't know, probably 5 times in the last, for different like seasonal jobs and things, like 5 times in the last couple of years. And like having philosophy and like having the ability to communicate um and listen and connect, it's like it's been this, and it hasn't always gone perfectly or even well in some cases, but it's been um this tool for me to be able to like embed myself with whatever environment I'm in. And I think without language, it becomes much more like the environments in which someone can like really flourish become like much smaller. And you know, I'm not saying that like people shouldn't try and set up their environments to you know, to uh like cooperate with their personalities. You know, if you know, if you need a lot of open space and you're more of an introvert, maybe living in a big city is not, you know, not going to work for you. But I think like language and the ability to communicate is such a um yeah, it's such an instrument for connection across environments. And it's really, I think it's really like the tool for anti-fragility you speak about, Daniel. But yeah, I'll pass it back. But I don't know exactly when I'll have to go, when the bell will ring, but I'll be here until that happens.
Well, we don't want you to fail to groom your, you know, to take care of your body properly, and you must eat, because that would like betray the entire meaning of what we have discussed. There's a few things that come to mind, and I just want to read more beautiful parts out of Clayton's work here. But there is something here of where calculation is needed to precisely get to the place where, say, for example, you've designed a society where you can get access to food, where you can get access to all of those things, and thus can be concerned and work on speech in the way we're trying. It's almost like I want to say you calculate to a successful environment so that then you have the space to steward the relationship between the unit, communication, and the community, so that you can give rise to new complexities, right? And basically much of history, I suppose, has been going through a process where calculation was needed to even engineer the space so that we could steward this new complexity that could perhaps occur socially in terms of global pluralism. But the problem is, because calculation works so well, rationality, enlightenment work, technological thinking got us here, man. You know, it did so much for us. Because it works so well, it created a habit where then, instead of letting it pass off into stewardship, pass off into apprehension, to, you know, to let calculation pass off into apprehension. And also, when I say apprehension, you could associate that with what Aspasia means by authentic resonance, what the great legendary James Wigley means by insight. These all kind of go together. I do think it's also can be aligned with Bergson's intuition. But because calculation worked, we calculated we should keep doing it. Of course you did. And so we kept doing that. And so this environment, so we made an environment in which it was possible to steward the relationship between the unit, communication, and the collective. And you could say the main thing was to get good at communication. And yes, like as McCloskey shows in Frankfurt School, like a changing in rhetoric is what leads the institutions. Like you start calling the communist nations cancer, that directs the policy. Speech is way more powerful than we sometimes want to realize. And I guess I wanted to also say we're suggesting there is something ontological basically about communication. This would suggest perhaps why Plato form and Platonic dialogues kind of go together, that there is something interesting about Plato being both deep in dialogue and also in form is quite interesting. But, you know, for most of for most of human history, food scarcity meant hungry and empty happened together. And, you know, I go through some more, but the modern environment breaks the elegant system, as Clayton writes. Engineered foods exploit the confusion, emotional needs systematically go unmet. Food becomes the default solution. Intro receptivity, accuracy degrades. So there's this notion we've now made environments that basically kind of breaks the elegant system that is more natural of how properly to steward the embodied, right? So it used to be in nature, it would be kind of more straightforward on how to do the stewarding. Now it's not so much. And yet, ironically, you could argue that the environment has broken this elegant system, has precisely been given rise by the calculation that this very elegant system could be where we actually train well stewardship, to actually train well the relationship between unit and conversation and collective, right? So the same environment that gets us in these terrible, vicious feedback loops could also, it's kind of like, I always like that idea that, you know, the devil's greatest victory, you know, killing God was also his defeat on the cross, right? Like the greatest, like, you know, victory was actually the defeat. Likewise, the environment that makes us most susceptible to, Michael, wonderful to have you, sir. Thank you for being here, and go take care of the body, sir. Like the environment that can most get us like thrown into vicious cycles actually is the very one that could actually help us better coordinate virtuous cycles into greater complexity. So like that gives me some hope, because when I look at the environment as actually, like, yeah, it creates a meaning crisis, but the environment that creates a meaning crisis, I guess it's almost like, I want to say the environment creates a meaning crisis simply because nothing but meaning will suffice. Like there's a kind of grace in it, actually, because it's like, yeah, you have a meaning crisis. I'm not going to let you live anymore in history without meaning. I've been letting you go. It's almost like history is like, I've been letting you go on too long without meaning, dang it, like, or without actually owning this. Most of your meaning was just absorbed, so it was a lower resolution from givens. But no, it's time for you to actually have like full complex meaning based on diversity and coordination between unit and collective. And I'm not going to let you go on anymore because I love you, man. Not to anthropologize history, but it's kind of fun. I actually want you to develop that fuller complexity. And so this very space where we can learn to coordinate the relation between the unit and the collective is now, but without the thinking of stewardship, we're probably not going to do that, because actually, as I'm talking, like we tend to think of ourselves, we may say we're not Cartesian anymore. Your paper has so many fantastic sections. I haven't even gotten to, I wrote so many, I haven't even gotten close to all the ones I want to read. This is really great. But I love this line. I'll finish the point I was making. We're socially overstimulated, but emotionally starved specifically of the possibility of becoming a we. Oh, yes, we are. But we're also not trained in communication to coordinate the unit into the community, so we can't be a we. There's the individual and the collective. Funny enough, the collective's not really a we. Like, you only are going to have the collective become a we if it can coordinate with the individual, right? But that would require the ability to communicate and coordinate, and we can't do that. I love that line. But the thing I was going to say, what I was going to say is that we still metaphorically have this idea of basically ghost in the machine, right? So we're a ghost in the machine. We're the consciousness is real, more real than the body. It might be we're a ghost in the machine. So then as an individual, we're like an individual in a collective. Like we're in a prison. The language is prison, right? It's a metaphor of prison, right? And so like we're in the society, it's Rousseau, everywhere in chains. In society, I'm everywhere in chains. I didn't have the state of nature kind of thing, right? Well, we basically then seemingly rebelled against that by saying, well, there is no consciousness, so you're not a prisoner. So we dealt with the problem. It's like, don't worry, guys. We know you felt like a prisoner, but you don't exist. So actually, it's cool now because there is no you. Actually, it's fine. That's literally how we dealt with the problem. It's like, we know you feel like a prisoner. We know you feel like just like a nobody in the collective. We know you don't have community or family or church no more. Don't worry, you don't exist. And it didn't, it was a noble try, but it just made everything way worse. But without the stewardship analogy, what other direction are you going to go in? We're a ghost in a machine. We're prisoners. We're stuck in society. The only option is just you don't exist. It's epiphenomena. We know you think you have conscious experience. We know you think all that stuff you care about exists, but it doesn't. So the prisoner doesn't exist. The prisoner doesn't exist. That's how modern society dealt with making everyone feel like a prisoner. It's by saying that the prisoner doesn't exist. And thanks to you, we know better. Clay, let me throw it at you on any thoughts about anything on this fine evening.
Oh my God. You're just killing me with us unexisting ourselves as a solution, only to find that actually we still exist. I mean, funny enough, this is so prevalent because you find that people are walking towards we're speaking about creativity here. One of the biggest challenges with creativity is that you will succeed, and then now you have to exist with the creation, and that is so terrifying that many people don't engage in that. Like, this is why we're losing language, because language is essentially a practice. It's a practice. It's a creation, and we have to continuously participate and extend the creation so that we can continue that direction towards the complexity that is apprehensible, right? So we have to keep building towards that which will be apprehensible. But to what point? And from what you've articulated, it's to the point of meaning. It's like, and not just any meaning, not calculated meaning, but complex meaning, like that deep, complex meaning. And when you look historically, what has been deep, complex meaning, this is all in your the mystical realm, right? The spiritual realm, because those are deep, sacred mysteries that, they're so rich with meaning that we always get more from them. And when we forget that and sort of like try to find the meaning in you, let's say not in the complex, but in the complicated, it withers. It's not sufficient. The meaning of the complicated is not sufficient. Because you get to the bottom of it. I mean, it's certain. It gives you that confidence because it's certain. It has a clarity to it. It's very finite. The part that we don't speak about is that it's also really small, and it's not reaching. It's not rich enough, and it's fleeting, and so we can't anchor ourselves to it. It can't take us far. But when you're in a situation of suffering and you just need a little token to get you to the next day, I guess the calculated meaning is sufficient. I mean, like, that's why you find, like, in all survival situations, like, all you need is the thing that will get you to the next point, and that's enough, right? But at a deeper level, you then come to that moment of crisis, which that self-reflective question happens, like, is this all there is to this? Like, I just have to keep getting the next token to the next token? Is this the game now? And the ultimate answer, I guess, by the rising of that question is like, actually not. That is not the game. And therefore, I need to find the actual game. And of course, it presents itself as a challenge. But the challenge of finding the actual game, the complex game, is so terrifying. It's so huge that, yeah, I mean, like, how do you create obviousness from scratch? Yeah, it's it's not obvious how to create obviousness, right? It's not that obvious. You have to go on a quest, go on a journey, transform, like, really, like, create at such a deep level whereby your next self is one of the creations you're building. That's how deep and complex the job is. But of course, like, why do that when you can just live on a token, right? and with all these advancements, they're talking about, automation and AI and giving people tokens for survival, the basic income thing. It's like, look, you don't have to do anything meaningful now. We've automated everything. Everything is calculative and very predictable in a calculative way. So, and like you said, we already said you don't exist. So now whatever is left of you should go away, because now we can just calculate everything and the end. But it's like, okay, but to what is that really the end? Like, is that it? No. I disagree. We should become stewards and steward ourselves towards a much more complex meaning. And that will definitely lead us to the next level. And I guess that's how you reboot life. That's how you get to restart it, because, like, you complete this level of complexity such that you can start the next level of complexity. Anyway, I'll pass it back. I'm throwing a few new concepts in there, but
Oh,
let's
no, no,
see.
no. Those are all absolutely fantastic. And Clayton, your paper is magnificent. I will probably need to start dripping sinks before too long because it's so freaking cold, but I still have some time. So first, I love the idea that it's like, you don't exist. So can you please go away now? Like, just go to your room, be done. Like, again, I keep talking about global hikimorism. I do think that is like basically the logic of our age. Like, that's where calculation ends. If you can get food without leaving your room, why would you leave your room? If you can be entertained all the time without leaving your room, why would you? If you can get all of the pleasures of life, sexual, food, whatever, without dealing with people, why would you? Because people are hard. So you don't. Hmm. So you don't exist. So just go away now. Just go away. Whew. So also I meant to bring this. It's interesting because the phrase spiritual needs, very often when people talk about spiritual needs, they do talk about it in terms of like people, like community, like coordinating with others. Like there's like spiritual needs are always interesting as a phrase because they seem to suggest I need some sort of sense of otherness, right? It can be church, it can be God. Well, if spirit is indeed like, well, complexity, like there's something about the word spirit that always does seem to be pointing to the complexity, the movement, like the higher order movement, right? And so it's interesting to think of spiritual needs as precisely the problem of unit communicating with the collective. Like in that actually a society that has a certain lack of spiritual needs, of fulfilling spiritual needs, is one that, well, is unable to successfully communicate between the unit and the collective. Therefore, nothing can form. There's no formation. And it is interesting to think of spiritual needs as tied to formation, which is found in that space of communication between the unit and the collective. And I would argue, actually, that this would be a longer argument from like belonging again, is that basically in the 18th century, when sociology was starting, really, kind of the word comes up with Comte and someone else whose name might escape me, is when society becomes aware of itself as a thing. And we found the social too difficult, so we went with the machine. We went the logic of capital to mediate social relations, because social relations that were complex and globalized and different were hard because you were different. I didn't know how to talk with you. But if I tell you, hey, we're both, this item is $20. You could be Muslim, I could be Christian, but we both understand $20. And so we could mediate social relations without the voice. So we basically in the 18th century chose the machine versus the voice, is the way I like to say. We chose the logic of capital for voicecraft. And that was not necessarily the wrong choice, actually. It should be noted. It will only retrospectively become the wrong choice if at this moment in history, when it's time to move to the voice, we don't. And then it will be as if we always already had made the wrong choice. But I actually think it's kind of contingent upon now. Because you could argue we had to make the Hegelian error of the logic of capital precisely to get to the place where we could handle the sublation of voice and the social, actually. So it wasn't an error, and it's kind of a Schrodinger's cat. It was both an error and not an error at the same time, depending on if we steward the relationship now. So that really matters. I'm now also thinking about, I think on this kind of idea that I do think there are points in history when token meaning or complicated meaning is fine because of the historic episode, right? Now, but as history goes along and develops and you get technological advancement, then what was sufficient for previous generations is no longer sufficient. And we are now in an age that requires complex meaning, right? And that's kind of a Hegelian logic, is that history is this kind of great forcing function that, let's say you had a cup this big at this point in history, then you could just fill the water here and you'd be good to go. But there's a way in which, as history advances, it pushes the cup larger, and now you need more water to fill it, if you will. And that history has this opening capacity. But as it opens capacity, it's like Dante describing the kind of, as you increase capacity, the kind of meaning that will fulfill you is going to have to become more complex. Let's just say it that way. right? And so in task-based societies, as then task-based meaning was sufficient. It was fitting for a task-based society, but or a token-based society. But as you get voice-based society, the meaning has to be voice-based, or else it's not sufficient. And that means it has to be complex meaning, and that means it has to be found in the coordination between the unit and the collective and the community. And thus the complex meaning will come from a successful communication between the unit and the community, because that's going to generate formation and the form. And anything short of that at this moment in history is going to be a problem. The other thing I'm now thinking when you're saying about complex meaning in mysticism and religious truth and God and different things, because it's always interesting how when people have a mystical experience, there's an obviousness to it, right? There's a kind of, it's not calculated, it's entire and all at once, right? And we've spoken about how basically you can't bring people together via calculation, because calculation is infinite. It goes on and it never necessarily arrives at an endpoint, right? So you have to get some sort of obviousness or apprehension. The other thing that's very interesting about obviousness, it almost by definition has to be simple, meaning it's not composite. It has no extensions. It's whole and entire. Because if there was an extension, there would be calculation. So the obvious has a entirety to it. That is a circle. That is a door. That there's an obviousness to it, right? So here's the $1 million. This is, I think, the giant onto-epistemological problem. Basically, what is being said is that the complex has to become simple, or else it falls into the calculation problem. So what ends up happening is greater complexity, by definition, is harder to make simple. But if it is not made simple, it will have an extension. And if it has an extension, then it is calculated. And if it is calculated, then you have a problem, because it is not obvious. Because even like the problem is this, like if you have 99.999% accuracy and it's right, but 0.1, and you don't know out of the whole, what is the 0.1, it destabilizes the entire 99, right? Because you got it. Like if there's a single lie out of 1,000 truths and you don't know which one is the lie, it changes your relationship to the entire 1,000 premises, right? So if you have a single calculation, you're in trouble, right? Like if you have a mystical experience and have a single thought, was it God? Then it loses its power, right? Like it loses it. So you can't have a single calculation, a single extension. But wait a minute. Complexity by definition means that there's more units, there's more dimensionality, which is the opposite of simplicity, right? Like isn't that the opposite? So basically, there's a sense in which our role as stewards, in a social sense, is stewarding the relationship between the complexity, so that it can be apprehended simply to create a new obviousness. Like we have to figure out how to steward global pluralism to make the complex experienced as simple, like as obvious, right? But it has to be apprehended as obviously, say, good, or obviously like beneficial, or obviously affording form. Like the question is, what exactly would we apprehend when we apprehended the complexity into a simplicity? What would we be apprehending, right? Well, if I take it in that mystical direction, and I'm thinking, Dante, we'd have to apprehend basically the dance of the heavens, which is like the movement of all the jaybirds. What I mean by that is the movement of the stars, like harmony, meaning you'd have to apprehend all of the different parts moving like the jaybirds. You know the jaybirds where you got like 1,000 little birds and they all just move at the same time, right? Kind of magically, without communication, like a field, like a Levin field or whatever. Like we'd have to basically somehow apprehend global pluralism moving like those jaybirds. Like we'd have to like apprehend it moving as a field. And it would be obvious that it moves as a field. It would have to become obvious that all this stuff on the social coordination mechanism, or that we are doing, actually moves together in some sort of way. And it is somehow simple in its complexity. How do you do that? How do you show that? I mean, because the other problem, well, so I'm going to throw out things at the end, okay? So, because now because the other problem with obviousness is by definition, it can only be experienced. Because if it's obvious, then it's not, because the simple has to be experienced. Because if I can explain it to you, then that means I can separate it. I'm calculating it, right? Like there's something about obviousness that is necessarily experiential, right? Because it's obvious. I see it and it's obvious. Like the obvious I guess this is what I'm saying. The obvious can't be obvious if it must be explained, right? So it can't be explained. So if there's any degree of explanation that occurs, then it's not obvious, right? So it has to be something that you apprehend, right? But then the very act of telling someone is explaining it, right? Like I'm telling you, and so the explanation of the obviousness is not equal to the obviousness. So what I'm trying to say is that ultimately obviousness in its purest obviousness, which is a funny phrase, is an experience. If it's not an experience, it's not what it is, right? So ultimately, to experience this Jaybird global pluralism Dante stuff, those were hyphens between all those words, just so you know, there was hyphens between them all, then it would have to be an experience. People would have to be brought into the experience of it. And seemingly in the experience of it, it becomes believable. It becomes more obvious that there's kind of a field that kind of works. And, you know, you could argue if you have dialogos conversations or conversations with people that suddenly go on for 2 hours and 30 minutes without you noticing, it becomes pretty obvious that there's some sort of like magic, quote unquote, that appears between people. There's some sort of like wild way that things just kind of unfold and move, and suddenly there's just a wild way where you have ideas you've never had before. Like this isn't like the last things I've been saying for the last 15 minutes I've never thought in my life, and here we are, as if I've always thought it. There's an always alreadiness to it as well in these conversations. It's like, oh yeah, you know, of course, obviously. It's like you've never thought that in your life, and yet then you talk, and it's wild the fittingness of it. Right? There's a wild sort of like, but no, it's not random. It's not out of nowhere. There's a fittingness. There's a sort of like in conversation. I think this is the communication that's ontological. There's a sort of newness. Never thought of that before. But then it's like, of course, it's fitting, and it's an always already, all at the same time. There's a wild experience of temporality in those kind of conversations that in that very experience suggests the ontological reality of communication as some sort of unique coordination of the unit in the community in a formal way. And, you know, that there's in the jazz improvisation, you know, Vervaeke talks about that. I love jazz improvisation, obviously, but all of that seems to be tied to the experience of the obviousness that must be apprehended on average by people in global pluralism in order to apprehend the value of complex meaning found in global pluralism versus try to calculate it. Because if they try to calculate it, they're going to end up asking if global pluralism makes us rich, if it makes us GDP, if it makes us money. And some, but you know, the others may not feel that the existential cost is worth it if it ends up creating a bunch of vicious cycles that they're in that destroys their hygiene. I have your paper's great. Any final thoughts today, Clayton, or anything at all? Everyone, go read the paper. I got notes everywhere. The Embodied Steward. Clayton, thanks for writing this.
Yeah.
It was really great of you to write this.
No, you're very welcome, and it will be up on my on my Substack, which you can access livedquality.com, and so you
Divine.
should. Yeah, you should be able to read it soon and download a copy if you want to. I'll put a downloadable copy as well. And yeah, and I will be releasing like follow-up you know, pieces of it, sort of like follow-up articles, just trying to articulate the same you'd say ideas, but from my own personal, you know, anecdotes, like, you know, like the moment of the rain, like what actually happened, and how that sort of like fed into this ideology, and so I plan to do like a bit of a series, sort of like that relates to the paper to make it more accessible to the everyday, and I guess which goes to what you're just saying then about what we can do about it. Like I guess like one of the things we can do is to continue to language it in a way that helps to bring it closer to obviousness. And most of these things seem you know, esoteric or too academic or too, you know, too strange for our everydayness, but actually they're always happening in our everydayness, and you know, they happen regardless we pay attention to them or not. And so one of the things that inspired me to write it was, well, someone has to say something about it, and in whichever way. And I like what what's his name, Martin Shaw. He was recently on one of conversation. I think he's released a book and he's being interviewed, and he was saying that, you know, storytelling is all about, you know, one's own wild truth. It's like you have to tell your wild truth because it's so strange to anyone else. And I like that idea because I guess the more these truths are being said in all these weird, wild ways, slowly we start to, you know, cohere the apprehensible, right?
Yes.
And soon it starts to become more obvious. But we all have a part to play in it. We all have to say our wild truth, and it's in so doing that we complexify the experience so that we can then move on to the next version. Yeah, and which goes to remind me about the map and the territory as well. I was drawing it here. It's like every piece, every piece of complexity we complete is like a completed part of the map.
Yeah.
But there's more to explore, and all the calculation we're doing is to figure out the next parts of the map that we haven't yet, you know, completed to explore. And if we complete them, they will become apprehensible and usable, and we will know how to work in those spaces.
Right.
But the work must continue. But I guess the thing that I'm learning from our conversation today that's been very so rich for me is that it means we do need to support the calculation, but the calculation is towards the end of complexity, because I think it gets lost within itself.
Yes.
You will have all these scientists doing all this work, and they forget the telos. It's like, what's the point of it? And it gets misdirected. It gets corrupted in ways of trying to undo already what's apprehended, yeah, or what's already apprehensible. Yet I think it should be focused towards making things more, you know, apprehendable.
Yes.
And I guess as that, you know, with that realization, I think we need to encourage that more.
Yes.
And I guess like it's obvious to them as well. Like they know it. That's what they want ultimately. But it can be a lot of work that can consume you, and you can get lost in it, and you know, forget about what you need to be aiming at, like start to miss the point, which is the whole you know, sinfulness, corruption, and all of that. But yeah, it's been great, like to kind of like get it to a place, to get this paper to a place where it's apprehendable in some way. And I feel like there'll be more work to be done to make it even more apprehendable. But it's work I'm happy to do. I love this kind of thing. I feel like I'm participating with it, and it's participating with me, and even just me and the paper are having a good time. It's like even when it's extended to the rest of you, we just, you know, make the party bigger, and yeah, we keep celebrating. Yeah.
Well, I am all about making parties bigger, and I'm glad you started the party. And yes, that feeling of having a party with the paper, I completely agree with that feeling. Couldn't agree more. It is tremendous work, and yeah, I mean, you know, we need to calculate to create spaces where we can steward via communication the relation between the unit and the communal, of which may generate new form and thus new complexity, right? So calculation is very important for the creation of the capitalism. Capital is extremely important for the creation of spaces where this stewardship is possible. But if we don't engage in this stewardship, then the calculation becomes an end of itself, and it becomes spurious. It becomes infinite. It runs out of energy. It just runs out because it can't ever stop. Because the only way to stop basically a process is a no knowledge put, like an apprehension. Like you apprehend the conclusion. You can't calculate to the conclusion. Or, well, again, I keep mentioning the halting problem, like you don't know for sure, but if we just do a little more calculation, but the problem is a calculation that reaches a conclusion versus one that gets us in an infinite loop cannot be determined. They cannot be told immanent within itself, right? And that's why there's always reason to keep calculating, because maybe it's different this time. I call this the pitch and risk, is how I think about it in Pynchon novels, Thomas Pynchon novels. But instead of that, you basically have to just recognize that problem. That's what's funny. You just kind of have to apprehend the problem of calculation leading to calculation, right? And how do you do that if calculation doesn't entail apprehension? Well, that's the kind of hell locked from the inside problem, right? And I would say that the likelihood of people apprehending that problem of calculation is low if people aren't languaging it or telling their wild truth or getting on or doing something that seems like it's not going to make a difference, like getting on these spaces and having these conversations, right? Because you're like, oh, what's the point? Well, if no one is doing it, then the probability of people or a society locked in calculation encountering the idea that it needs apprehension is zero, because there's no chance of encountering that in the system, right? And I do think that Paul Kraffel is, when he's talking about accumulation being negentropic, is correct. If there's a lot of people like doing this kind of stuff, then it accumulates something that then could possibly communicate with the state or the structure of calculation to emerge to new complexity. So I think it's really important to tell your wild truth, or else all of the calculation that's basically locked in of itself has basically no chance of happening to encounter that, which would make it realize the apprehension, that would grant upon it the apprehension of its state, that would then make it aware of the need to begin to steward via communication the relation between the unit and the community, so that apprehension could be afforded. But that would not occur if people didn't tell their wild truths. And if you didn't tell your wild truth, so thank you for doing that in this work. The Embodied Steward, a theory of nested emergence and the technologies of self-maintenance. Clayton, I don't know where the time went. I enjoyed every second of it. Thank you for being you. Thank you for your work. And it has been a complete and utter delight, as it always is, Clayton. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danielle.